Good morning again, and thank you for staying with us for the first panel session called Shifting Coalitions for the Future of the American Electorate. We put this panel together in light of the 2020 election and new data from the 2020 census talking about all things kind of how are the populations of the country changing, how's that going to influence progressives and conservatives in the public policy and the legislation that we put forward. So with that, I'm going to invite our panelists and our moderator up, and we're going to end around 1 p.m. to go to the lunch session. So let's welcome our panelists.
Well, good morning. My name is Ruth Kelly, and I am pleased to be a moderator today. I appreciate the audience here, that you're taking the time on a Saturday to come out and discuss this important topic. You have probably read a little bit about me, but I am a former city commissioner for the city of Grand Rapids. I served 10 years, served the 2nd Ward. And today's topic, Shifting Coalitions and the Future of the American Electorate, is an incredibly important topic right now as we're all watching the news and concerned about the future of our democracy. I would like to also thank the Hauenstein Center and my friend Noreen Myers, who's probably here in the audience, for recommending this opportunity to me, and I'm so pleased to be able to do that. Thank you, Noreen. Thank you, Grand Valley and the Hauenstein Center. So I want to start by introducing our panelists. On my left, we have Kathleen Bruinsma. Kathleen is a Grand Rapids attorney, a former board member of the Progressive Women's Alliance of West Michigan, and a member of the Grand Rapids Community College Board of Trustees. Ms. Bruinsma received her bachelor's degree in political science with honors from Providence College and her law degree from the University of Notre Dame. Before joining private practice in law, Kathleen was a legislative director on elder affairs for the city of Boston. She has volunteered for the campaigns of progressive candidates in multiple states since 1986 as an envelope stuffer, a field organizer, and a voter protection attorney. She and her husband have a son and a daughter. So welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Ben Bourne, was not able to come today. He had car trouble, and he would have had to drive from up north from Charlevoix. So that's unfortunate. We would have loved to hear from him because he was first vice chair, affiliates director for the Libertarian Party of Michigan. So we will do the best we can with our current panel. And then we welcome Doug Koopman, PhD. Doug Koopman is a professor of political science at Calvin University, and he teaches most of his courses in the areas of American politics and government. He has a very broad knowledge and range of experience in practical politics, mostly in the legislative branch, but also in the executive branch, campaigns, advocacy, and lobbying. He's a native of Michigan with early years in rural Allegan County, and since 1995, he lives in Kentwood, right next to Calvin, where he works. So welcome, Kathleen and Doug, this morning. Appreciate your being willing to come. So we're going to get started and invite them to give us some opening remarks on what's going on now in terms of the results of the census and how it may affect the future of voting in America. So we don't know what's next for conservatives, libertarians, and progressives, and we don't have a crystal ball, but these two individuals have some insights that they're going to share today. So I'm going to start with this question. Looking at the results of the 2020 election and census, what short and long-term electoral trends have you identified? And please touch on age, race, gender, geographic location, and so on. I do have a brief chart that I would just like to share with you, just to give you a sense of the changes from 2000 to 2010 and then 2020 before they get into answering this. And these are the census categories: white Americans, Hispanic, Black, Asian, and then American Indian and Alaskan Native. So in 2000, the electorate was, in terms of the white category, almost 70%, 69.1. 2010, it went to 63.7. 2020, 57.8. The Hispanic or Latino population went from 12.5% to 16.3% to 18.7%, so it's growing. African American Black, 12.1%, 12.2%, and then 12.1%, so it stayed level. That was a surprise to me. Asian, 3.6%, 4.7%, and 5.9%, another growing population. And then Native American, Alaskan Native, 0.7%, 0.7%, 0.7%. So again, staying the same. So with that, a little background, let's start with Doug. Would you like to begin?
Sure, I'd be happy to begin. First, thanks to Grand Valley for this panel and for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I think today I'm supposed to be mostly the conservative. I could probably do a little libertarian on the side, given some of my own views, but I don't want to misrepresent any libertarian perspectives. But I first want to put on my hat as an instructor of research methods in the social sciences and talk about the limitations of talking about people in demographic senses and in categories and subcategories, particularly with the way today's campaigns are run with an infusion of big data, when campaigns and candidates and consultants can slice and dice an electorate to 10 or 15 or 20 or even 100 people based on a whole set of information that they have about each of us to try to manipulate us to kind of vote against vote against type and to be a counter type. So there is, at the 300,000 foot level, there's a bit of a mismatch between thinking demographically, race, gender, geography, and those age and those kinds of things, and how a sophisticated current campaign is actually run. The sophisticated campaigns sort of try to go after the residuals or the outliers and try to collect the outliers who might vote differently than their demographic group. So I just want to keep that in mind, because I do actually think it is very useful to think about the electorate the way Ruth has described, these age and gender categories. And so let me stay at that level with the caveat about how campaigns really run, that you try to pick people off almost one at a time. But two things about the next election. I guess I'll focus on the 2020 congressional elections. Just based on the census data and the growth in certain states and the reduction in other states, it is very likely that current Republican legislators at the state level will be able to create more Republican House districts. All other things equal, I would expect the House of Representatives elected in 2022 to be in control of the Republican Party and by a fairly significant margin. Not every state that is growing in population and thus has another congressional district or two is conservative or Republican, but many of them are. And then states that are border states or boundary states and losing population have tended to be a little more Democratic. Not all states have partisan control of redistricting, but in the big picture, I think the Republicans will be able to manufacture more House districts nationwide that will send Republicans to the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, Michigan is, of course, a little bit different. We have an independent redistricting commission, which I was happy to assign students 3 or 4 years ago when petitions were being circulated to get credit for doing that. We don't know how that's going to end up. It's interesting to watch it day to day and week to week and the changing plans and how they respond or don't respond to criticism. I do expect them to create maps both for the State House and for the State Senate and for the House of Representatives that by and large the proportion of seats will be roughly equal to the proportion of overall vote by the two parties for the state. In other words, if Michigan is 50-50 Republican-Democratic in the 2020 election, I would expect the State House and the State Senate to be roughly equally divided, as well as the U.S. House of Representatives. Individual districts, we don't know what those are yet and how they will switch. But the big picture, of course, nationwide and in Michigan, is apparently good news for the Democratic Party. The older groups, boomers and others, are getting smaller. They're dying out, or as they get very old, their participation rate reduces a little bit. Those tend to be Republican, and so if you think of it demographically by age, the Democrats have a better story to tell or an encouraging future to look forward to, as younger voters tend to vote Democratic. If you think of it ethnically, that would also be, at least in theory, better news for the Democratic Party as a general rule. I would say there are different stories for African Americans and Asian Americans and Latino Americans. The largest growing groups, Latino and Asian, and if you, to some extent, slice and dice them a little bit more carefully about what do you mean by Latino? Is that someone who is thinking about Cuba, a Cuban experience that they bring, or a Honduran experience that they bring? It really depends how they think about their other heritage, other than American, and what lessons about politics and government do they learn. One of the interesting things in Florida results that Trump did very good among a couple of Latino groups that were thinking about Cuba and were sensitive to the socialism charge in the Trump versus Biden thing. And so a little bit deeper dive into the subgroups in Latino is important, and I think also in the Asian American group too. It's a too big a category. It's almost too large for a journalist to write succinctly about in a typical piece in a newspaper, but for a campaigner, they slice and dice those groups into very much finer groups and differently target each of those groups in a different way. So for the Democratic Party, the good news among race and ethnicity, I think, is not quite as good as it looks at the top cut. Gender, I think tends to be good news for the Democratic Party as well. Women up and down the age and the race and the income and the lifestyle and all those trending Democratic, and I expect that really is pretty good news for the Democratic Party overall. So that's how I see answering your first question. I can imagine in 2022 short-term Republican gains in the U.S. House of Representatives, but the one thing about history is it keeps changing, that I could imagine all those being wiped out depending on the events of politics that happen after that.
Exactly. We're in an era right now where things are changing so rapidly. And to your remarks about the demographics, I know that I have gone door to door myself, and the tools that we are given now are truly focused on those individuals that you could sway one way or another. And we've had a lot of surprises in our polls, too. They're not as accurate as we used to find, because there are so many deeper dives into, say, a group of Latinos or so on, because of where they even live geographically. So Kathleen, anything you want to, you can feel free to respond to Doug, and also add a little bit more information about yourself as you consider this question.
Sure, thank you, Ruth. I am going to apologize at the outset. I might have to take my mask off. I am fully vaccinated. I am having a terrible time breathing. This does not happen. And if everybody's okay with that, I'd like to do that. Thank you. I'm Kathleen Brinsma. I am really happy to be here. I thank the Hauenstein Center for existing, for having this talk. It's good to be in person for this. I am an attorney. I'm in private practice. I represent corporations, big and small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and nonprofit organizations in compliance, employment, trademark, and some property matters. I'm really happy to be here because I think I've been thinking a lot about Orwell's 2 minutes hate in 1984, and how people looked at a screen for 2 minutes every day, stopped what they were doing, looked at a screen, and were shown pictures of their enemy and all the bad things that their enemy was doing. I feel like social media is doing that to us now. I think we have to work hard to overcome that, and so these kinds of conversations are beautiful. I also was raised in a two-party household. One of my parents votes Democrat, one of my parents votes Republican. We at the dinner table were always finding common ground, not just to keep the peace, although I think a little bit that was part of it. But when you talk about issues and listen to the other side, you hear your overlap, you find your overlap. And so my brothers and I were conditioned to do that. In our conversation before we came out here, Ruth and Doug and I think we came maybe on 2 or 3 things already that we agree on.
Shh, don't tell.
Yeah, don't tell. So I'm happy to be here, and I am a progressive, and my guidebook is really the Constitution. I think it's a beautiful template for equal rights. I think it's a beautiful template for equal justice. And with that being my worldview, and looking at the 2020 election, my biggest takeaways from the 2020 election start with the context in which it occurred. We had a deadly pandemic that at that point had killed, I think, roughly 260,000 people in this country. It had not been managed properly from the outset. It had been denied at the outset. The administration had several missteps, and people were dying because of those. We also had what I will call a twin pandemic, and that is sort of racial reckoning with what happened to George Floyd and how we all witnessed what happened to George Floyd. We were forced to sort of face race in this country, ethnicity in this country, what we might do. When we do our best until we know better, and then when we know better, we do better. And I think the summer of 2020, with the pandemic also going on, brought that to front of mind for many voters. Now, in that context, in the 2020 election, a beautiful thing is turnout was at a record high. It was at a record high in Michigan. We had 5.5 million votes cast, which is beautiful. I think we have common ground that in a participatory democracy, high turnout is good. And voters turned out. We had record turnout in the US, but I think it's been higher in prior elections a long time ago. So from that we can, and what were the candidates offering us? We can look at what both of the candidates were offering us. The more progressive of the two candidates on the presidential ballot in 2020 was offering us building back better. He was offering us going back to normal isn't quite what we want to do. And he won. Now, President Biden won with what I'm going to call a fragile coalition, looking at the election results and the census results. He won with voters of color. He won Michigan because of voters of color. He won nationally because of voters of color. Their turnout was higher in Michigan and in the United States than it was in 2016 and 2018. We have to pay attention to that. And he also peeled some white voters away from President Trump's 2016 coalition. Mostly whites with college degrees, but some whites with not. And we need to pay attention to that. The class inversion that has occurred between progressive and conservative candidates since Al Gore in 2000 is fascinating. The post-materialist voting, not to get too much in the weeds, by white voters. In 1960, President Kennedy won white voters without a college education 2-1. In 2020, Biden won white with college degrees 2-1. That is very important. It's something we need to look at. I see a lot of explanations for it, but I think they're a little simplistic right now, and so that's interesting. But overall, my takeaway from the 2020 election and the census combined are that President Biden has a fragile coalition. The census, to me, tells us that progressive-leaning voters, left-leaning voters have the numbers, which Dr. Koopman pointed out. And that is a good thing, and that's encouraging. But conservative Republican voters and leaders have an advantage structurally. And so as a progressive, I do not see demographics as destiny. The structural changes I see nationally are the map drawing, which Dr. Koopman mentioned. In the Sun Belt states in the United States, where voters of color, the population of voters of color increased the most, the Republicans still control the map drawing in those states, realizing that they don't control map drawing in all states, including the one where we're sitting now. And so that's a structural advantage. Another structural advantage is the United States Senate, where places where demographics haven't changed, voters of colors have not increased in population, those states still have 2 senators. The Electoral College also, I think, gives voice to places that have not seen a huge increase in voters of color. And the population in Michigan, looking now granularly here at our state, we did not have an increase in voters of color that other states have experienced. And so we need to turn out voters of color. We need to listen to them and center them. We also need to keep talking to the white voters. And when I talk about talking to white voters, I think what seems to really work is taking policy proposals down to their component parts and saying, here's what Build Back Better means for you. It means access to education. It means more investment in community college so your tuition is lower. More investment in other public schools so that your cost is lower. It means dental benefits for your grandmother. Similarly to what we saw in 2009 and 2010, when we take pieces of the Affordable Care Act and ask voters about them, they support them and they see how they will affect their lives. But when we call it Obamacare, voters say, no, thank you. I don't want that. And so those are the lessons for progressives in talking to white voters. And also, I do think we need to center the voters of color that are the reason why President Biden is in the White House. We need to talk about police reform. We need to go bold. I see that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act looks like it's probably dead. We might tie grant funding, Department of Justice grants, to police departments, to certification that you ban chokeholds. When we want to do bold things, we can do bold things. The Republican Party overruled the Senate parliamentarian in 2001 to get the Bush tax cuts through. We can go bold, and I think we need to serve the voters who spoke to us the most loudly, put the president in the White House, by responding to their policy needs. So those are sort of some of my takeaways from both the election and the census moving forward.
So as we talked a lot about the national situation, and Doug, you helped us understand too what's happening in Michigan. Can you talk a little bit about the potential policy impacts in Michigan and in terms of what's happened here with the census and the trends that you've seen? And not just policy, but also just how it might be used or envisioned as an opportunity for a conservative, or, and if you will, either one of you, a libertarian, and for you, a progressive. Either one of you can start and have that conversation. But looking a little more closely at Michigan and policy and some trends that we might see here in Michigan. Whether it is about running the elections or in general the goals of these parties.
Oh, it's your turn, I think.
Looking granularly at the state of Michigan on policies.
A little bit more closely at Michigan, yeah. Policies and trends.
Okay.
So for progressives, for example, what needs to happen in terms of how they address the challenges ahead, whether it is around the electorate in voting, the different communities that you discussed that are sometimes being, or need to be heard?
Right. Priorities for progressives in view of what we saw in 2020 with the election and also the census data, one of our biggest priorities needs to be voting rights. I think we're seeing now what we saw in 2009 and 2010 in North Carolina after Barack Obama was elected the first time. We're seeing some targeted laws being proposed that would make it much harder for eligible Black, Brown, Asian American, Hispanic, Latinx voters from casting a ballot. We need to fight those. We need to ensure they're not passed, and if they are passed and signed into law here in Michigan, we need to try to guide voters through those measures as much as possible and overcome them. As a voting rights attorney, I can say that these laws that are being proposed here in Michigan are not needed, they're not necessary, they're not based on any facts, they're based on propaganda, and the reason I know that is because I've been a legal observer in polling places for multiple cycles. The people who work in our polling places are Democrats and Republicans. We have a rule in Michigan that we need to get an even number from each party. They take their job seriously, they know the law, they understand the law, they turn people away who should not be there. So the system, the voting system, runs well in Michigan. It is free and fair. And the same is true for our Secretary of State's offices and our county clerks, Democrat, Republican. They take their job seriously, they know what they're doing. The system is free and fair. And so these laws that are being proposed are an attempt to put barriers up to the coalition, the fragile coalition that did elect Joe Biden in 2020. And so fighting those laws from being enacted here in Michigan is a big priority. I think looking at the trend of young voters who are millennials and Gen Zers here in Michigan, they will increasingly become a part of the electorate, bigger percentage of the electorate. We have to look at minimum wage. We have to look at immigration reform. We have to look at tolerance. I think I have 2 Gen Zers in my household. They don't respond to cultural, those people are very different from us, arguments like some voters do in other generations. And so I think climate with the millennials and the Gen Zers also, we really, really have to put at the forefront. That's existential.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. That's what we're hearing from them, even here locally. There was a proposal recently that, and the city commission debated it and listened to proponents of a resolution to declare the climate change an emergency. So, yeah, it's very much on the minds of, I think, all of us. Doug, do you want to respond to? And then we can maybe get into, after that, some of the more, to talk about some of these initiatives that are coming forward.
Sure. Yeah, so there's several topics that Kathleen mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit about them. I think the first one is this package of voting bills that the governor will veto, and then there's also a move to put them initiative and bypass the governor later on. I think in general, I don't disagree with the general cut that this is disproportionately harm some traditional constituencies who have voted for the Democratic Party or for progressive. I do think it's a bit uncertain what the overall effect would be. If we do have this class inversion that's going on, that the Republican Party is tending to drawing more voters from, in a political sense, those more at the margin of politics, they don't vote as often, they have a lower educational level, they move up. there will be some barriers to those voters also participating in later elections too, and the ratio or the proportion of either voter turnout might not be so starkly on one side as the other. I think that we don't know the consequences yet, and I won't disagree with the general point, but I'm not sure how, if you just look at it in partisan terms, how stark that the turnout or the results might be. I think I won't say it will be a wash, but it'll be complicated to see what the partisan effect might be if, in fact, those things, some of them become law in the state of Michigan. Census data. Of course, at the state House and the state Senate, you have the same number of seats, 38 and 110. And those are all being redrawn by the Independent Redistricting Commission. And so you have to look at what parts of Michigan have grown and what have shrunk. Grand Rapids has grown tremendously. Ottawa County has grown tremendously. Grand Traverse area has grown tremendously. And then the other indicator is to some extent draw those in ways that are geographically attractive. Like you don't immediately look at it and say, wow, that snakes all around the place, and that's an unfair district. To me, that will give more power to probably the inner ring of the outer suburbs and the outer ring of the inner suburbs, maybe like southern Kentwood, if you're from here, southern Kentwood to northern Caledonia, right? And those are the toss-up. Those were the toss-up voters in 2020. Those were the households that split. That the husband voted Republican and the wife voted Democratic. And it will be really interesting. So to me, the balance of party control is probably that family, both husband and wife, and the young people who have that experience of kind of being tired of the old partisan divisions and not wanting to identify completely with the Republican Party, not wanting to identify completely with the Democratic Party. And I think it'd be highly competitive elections. And I think depending on where the lines are drawn, I think you'd have a lot of toss-ups, and typically what happens is there's a late breaking wave one way or the other, and I don't know what that would be. I'd be more willing to predict whether the state House and Senate would be Democratic and Republican like 2 days before the election, but we're a little bit further out than that. I just think it would be a highly competitive election, vulnerable to late breaking external events. You can guess kind of what those might be. One could imagine we'll have a debate about abortion, and that if the Supreme Court lets Michigan law become law, does that stay the same, or do we change that? You can imagine a topic that really decides the 2020 election that we're not talking about today at all in Michigan. Yeah. But we're setting up for a wave. I think we're actually being set up for a wave election in the state legislature in Michigan, but I have no idea which way that will go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about those Michigan initiatives a little bit more, and I'll quickly summarize them. There are 3 that we can talk about, but also I'd be interested in hearing from both of you, and Doug particularly because you're professor of political science right now, on the whole initiative process as in itself, and whether it's a good idea always, and particularly how it's structured in Michigan. But there's the Secure Michigan Vote, whose proponents claim it offers security and protection from fraud, but its detractors claim that it actually suppresses voting. And that involves toughening ID laws around absentee voting. There are some changes where you would, if you're not on the permanent list, for example, you would not automatically get a ballot. And you would have to also require voters to write your state ID number or the last 4 digits of your Social Security number on an application for your ballot. If you don't, then the voter will be provided a provisional ballot, and you've got to go to the clerk's office within 6 days after the election for that to count. It would bar unsolicited absentee ballots applications to voters. So as you know, during the pandemic, those were sent out to people in large part because we had a pandemic and to protect people from having to go to the polls actually and vote, barring unsolicited absentee voters, I just said that, and prohibit private election funding, which would not allow any acceptance of private money or in-kind contributions from outside groups to help conduct elections. So that's a secure Michigan vote. And then the other is yes on the national popular vote. And interestingly here you've got a Democrat and Republican who are supporting this. Mark Brewer, who's an election law attorney, who's a former chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party, and Saul Anusis, a political consultant who's a former chairman of the Michigan Republican Party and former member of the Republican National Committee, are both working on this petition drive for yes on national popular vote, which would award the state's electoral college votes to the winner of the national popular vote. And then finally, a proposal to change the way electors work in Michigan, which would likely help Republican candidates by ending the state's winner-take-all system that last year allocated all 16 electoral college votes to Joe Biden. So there are three, and not only are these all interesting and subject for debate, but again, it's back to initiatives in their own right. And I know with the Secure Michigan vote, there is some concern that it would not necessarily go to the people for a vote, that the legislature, if the petitions are gotten, would be able to vote on that. So either one of you can start. Doug, why don't we start with you? If you could talk a little bit about, I mean, again, not to try to make you start each time, but but I know you are probably looking at this and probably talked about that in your classes.
So I did, actually. My class yesterday talked about
well,
Michigan.
perfect,
and
perfect.
Because I wrote on the whiteboard the notion that the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. Agree or disagree?
Good question.
I disagree. I mean, I'm on the disagree side myself. I'll just actually tell you that. And setting aside kind of the partisan implications of all these things that we've done in Michigan the last 4 years, both for the redistricting commission and this Secure Michigan vote, we have a lot of mechanisms to bypass our legislature and our governor. And partly it's a function of being in the upper Midwest and the progressive wing of the Republican Party in the early 1900s and the late 1800s being willing to trust the wisdom and discretion of the voter and skeptical of the machines that ran state legislatures. So we do have these things. Michigan and other upper Midwestern states have these things that bypass the legislature and the executive. The Independent Redistricting Commission was one of those ways, and we have a referendum and initiatives all the time in Michigan. California has broader ones than we do, but Michigan is pretty generous that way. And each one is tweaked a little bit. You know, how many signatures do you need? It's usually a proportion of the vote of the last time. And some of those outcomes, some of those things that go through that system seem good ideas. Partly depends on your partisan perspective. And some of them you look at, wow, that's a deliberate attempt to have a minority faction, as David French would talk about minority factions at the founding, circumvent the will of the whole. And it's just interesting to see that mechanism tried this year by the Republican Party for some controversial voting measures that will be, which when they get through the legislature, if they do, they'll be vetoed by the governor. And of course, this process prevents the governor from vetoing. I mean, there is a bit of a question whether all this will happen by election day next year. Will that actually happen? So I'll just stop there. It's just we have such a democratic process in Michigan. In other words, ways to circumvent elected officials. Arguably, I think we have too many of them, to be honest with you. I'm not a fan of term limits. I'm a fan of having qualified and thoughtful and experienced people in public office from the city level to the governor's office. And sort of the premise of a lot of these mechanisms in Michigan is that those folks tend to be corrupted and are more corrupted than the average person. I don't have that premise, I guess.
Right.
I think being in public service is a calling and a gift, and if you have those sets of skills and abilities and can solve problems, that you should be there for a longer period of time. So I'll just stop there about how democratic Michigan is, and maybe get the other part of those questions, but I want to hear from my other panelists, Kathleen.
Yeah, and I certainly understand the term limit issue. Fortunately, I was term limited as well, but that law in Michigan passed during my term, so I had 10 years instead of 8. But it takes 4 years to figure out what's going on, and policy takes a long time to figure out. So you are, you're essentially, I think we mentioned this in our earlier conversation, to some degree, you're turning over those decisions to the staff at the city, to the lobbyists that might be at the state level and so on. And I do wonder how much these initiatives can potentially hamstring our legislators and box them in, and even lessen the amount of money they have to deal with for our budgeting processes. So, Kathleen, feel free to comment on any of these initiatives and in your overall sense of the process itself.
I think we all agree that the three of us here sitting here agree that term limits are just not a structural good idea, and common ground. I'm glad for that. The securing the Michigan vote package, I will be very blunt and say that is blocking the Michigan vote package. That's my truth. And for the reasons that I said before, it's not necessary. We also have our Republican Senate committee here in our state who found no voter fraud in Michigan. Our elections are free and fair. So that is a block Michigan vote. The Electoral College, basically eliminating it in Michigan to have the popular vote, I think from a progressive lens, that is a great idea. I think the Electoral College, I see that as a structural advantage that the conservative party, the Republican Party has. I see it as a trump card on the will of the people. And for those who would come back and say, well, then we have the tyranny of the majority. Actually, we don't. We have courts. We have the United States Supreme Court. We have federal district courts. We have state courts. We have our Senate. We have our House of Representatives. And the allocation of our electoral votes, I don't know enough about that. I haven't looked at it closely enough to have an opinion on it. So I will leave that to Doug Koopman or better minds.
Good. I'm glad. I think we're finding an area of disagreement here, which I'm really enjoying. And of course I'm right, but I'm kidding. But what is genuine? We're under the subtext to both of us is what's genuine representation. And I want to align myself a little bit with David French about localism and geography. I've studied Congress and worked on Capitol Hill, and the default description of a member of Congress when she or he goes into their districts is that this is my district, and they mean a boundary, right? They mean a geography. They mean, Western Michigan or Grand Rapids City and its suburbs, or Detroit, neighborhoods in Detroit. And so there's this sort of common sense, person on the street definition that representation should be geographic, right? And I think the founders and the Constitution is structured that way. That is part of the explanation for the Electoral College, that states have a role to play because they're allocated by states, and all states. And so there's this sense of the most legitimate form of representation is geography, not race, not ethnicity, not partisanship, not socioeconomic. There's a long tradition, even in congressional studies, that no, the most important thing is symbolic representation. So if you have an African American district, that should be represented by a person who's African American. We need, and you look at the conference as a whole, or the caucus as a whole, or the Congress as a whole, we count how many women there are, we count how many racial and ethnic minorities they are, we count how many religious people they are and what religions they are from. And so that is sort of a collective, symbolic characteristic representation. I think both of those are legitimate representations. I do think the way to make progress politically on policy solutions, though, is to appreciate a little bit more strongly geographic representation. And I'm a little bit worried about the redistricting commission in Michigan now. There's one state Senate district that looks to some extent like Harry Potter's scar on his face, and it goes from southeastern Kent County down to St. Joe. And I'm thinking, how hard would it be to represent that as a member, as a woman trying to represent that district or a man trying to represent that district? That it's geographically so broad that to stay in touch with that's difficult. We have those in the UP in northern Michigan that's big enough, but to respect the geography and localism, I think we should do like more of that. I don't disagree at all that that a woman representative understands issues in a different way, typically, than a man does, and that both of those understandings are critical to reaching a resolution, or that people from racial or ethnic or sexual identity minorities, they're critical to listen to in decision making and critical to be part of a deliberative body. I don't disagree with that. I'm just wondering I think the best mix should move over a little bit more towards geographic than where we are today. But I do think that's a bit of a difference for us between the two of us.
That's interesting, if I may.
Yeah. Please do.
Doug, so this fascinating question, representation, and I think we're bordering now in the conversation on identity politics a little bit.
I wasn't going to go there, but thank you for getting us all the way there.
And and I'm not sure. I hear what you're saying. I'm just not sure that. I don't necessarily agree that if a district has a lot of Asian Americans that they should elect an Asian American person, or if it's majority female that they should elect a woman as their congressperson. I think it's about an ability to listen, and I don't know how geography might have a majority of farmers, like the district I grew up in Wisconsin. Does that mean only the farmers' interests? It's the balance. It's all about the balance and the representation, and that's just a fascinating question that we could spend 90 minutes on alone. Yeah.
So I don't think we're that far. I think we're good. One of my former bosses, Paul Henry, said the job of a representative is to learn to make the needs of your neighbor your own, right? So if you want to get in politics, you have to be a listener, right? And you have to listen to people who are different from you, right? And if you're a Republican, you have to listen to a Democrat. If you're a man, you have to listen to a woman. If you're wealthy, you have to listen to people at the margin. And I think Paul also brought in his faith in that you have to pay particular attention to people at the margins. Who's at the margin in your geographic neighborhood? Is it the poor? Is it a racial minority? Is it a sexual identity minority? Or those kinds of things. And getting that right it's a hard thing to do. I do think to some extent people who have been marginalized are better listeners. On the other hand, you could argue that that's the case because they understand that situation more than the dominant. But that's a generalization. I do think it all depends on individual people, who's running and how receptive are they to different views that are different from them. And how do they mix those in with their own views in effectively representing someone.
And how interested
the majority is in sharing power with the minority, or how interested those who have enjoyed the power for 200 or so years, how interested they are in sharing that power. I mean, all of these things come to play.
Well, yeah, and including an awareness that they are so much in power and that others are not. So it's complicated. So I'd like to move on to talking a little bit about the concerns that I think we all share around getting accurate information, truthful information, being told the truth, and the possibility that we can have these late breaking waves, like you say, that can throw an election and throw confusion into things, and then the role that social media can play. And what's the responsibility of social media? What's the responsibility of the voters themselves? Is there a role for the government here in regulation? Do we need to look at the FCC and update antiquated rules? So how can we begin to provide this electorate who's, we have a sense of who they are now and who's voting. We have so much coming at us so quickly, and in this last 4 years especially, crisis after crisis, the pandemic and so on. So how can we sort it out as individuals, and what's our responsibility as citizens, voters, social media, government?
Go ahead, Kathleen.
Is it a matter, do we regulate or do we not regulate? I mean, these are controversial questions, especially in the post-Reagan era of anti-regulation.
I think capitalism works when it's regulated. I think if we look at the 1950s as an example of regulation, taxes, I think that having the 2 minutes hate does not help us in making decisions about who we vote for. I think that we do already have regulation in our marketplace because I represent businesses, and I can say very confidently that the laws that are put in place by our government on every level benefit corporations, benefit our businesses. They have the benefits of regulation, of shielding personal assets, say, from corporate malfeasance, trademark protection, copyright protection. And so in exchange for the protection that regulation gives corporate entities, I think it's only fair that then they should perhaps be asked to have some contours in which they're operating. I think one of the reasons, frankly, that Facebook has not been regulated and has been able to allow false things about vaccinations, false things about candidates to proliferate on its site is because they give a lot of money to Congress members. And that's not right. And I think for anything that we've been talking about here to work, for our republic to maintain, the pandemic of disinformation needs to be addressed, and I do think regulation is one way to do that. And I think bureaucracy too, much to Mr. French's dismay, I will say the FCC has a role to play here. Having a free and fair internet is one piece of it, and then probably regulating, I don't know how we do it, the devil is in the details, but it's worth doing.
Mm-hmm. Doug, and then I just also want to mention that we will be giving you an opportunity to ask some questions, as well as those who might be watching on Zoom. But
yeah, I think we have a little disagreement, but not major disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
I do think, what is the hope? What is my standard? What is my expectation? What is the standard of my expectation for accurate political information, and in a realistic way? And I guess mine's probably lower than yours. One person's fairness doctrine is another person's censorship, right? And I think getting a little bit, extrapolating on what David French said earlier today is not every attempt to regulate is socialism, right? Some of it is to have a better market. And America really is not only a marketplace of goods and services, but it's a marketplace of ideas. It's actually a marketplace of religious expressions. There's no establishment of religion, but the free exercise is guaranteed. And so is that a decent enough standard, the marketplace of ideas, and that the notion that true ideas and sound ideas will last, and false ideas and lies will die out, I think is generally true in the long run, but boy, a lot of crap happens in that messy process. I guess I have a little more tolerance probably for messiness than you do, but I am irritated by the things that stay perpetuated and allowed to be on Facebook. But then I'm thinking, okay, what's a practical alternative? I don't know. And I'll just leave it at that. I guess I'm a little more tolerant of, I have a little stronger belief that the truth will out, or something that's plausible and arguable will out after a while, and the completely nutsy ideas, wherever they come on our political spectrums, will eventually be exposed as false. But it can take 6 months, 8 months. It can take a year or a couple of years. And damage is done in that, no doubt,
that's
no
the
doubt.
concern, right.
I'm not arguing that's the right way, but I think you just have to accept the fact that some damage is done, and it's a judgment call whether it's too much damage or that damage is acceptable. I agree, that's a judgment call. I'm a little more open to the free exchange of different ideas, I think, than you are.
Yeah, this is another topic that could take a
Yeah,
long time,
right.
including the transparency and how do you get at that? How do you control that? We've got so much that's happening so fast that wasn't the case for our parents.
Right.
So.
Right.
Thank you all for that. Shifting coalitions makes me think, what about this idea that floats around from time to time that the United States of America is too big, and that a state like California, maybe it's okay if they just secede? It sounds a bit outrageous, but at the same time, we are breaking up, almost literally, into the coasts and the heartland. Why not let that happen? I mean, I'm asking this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but why not?
All right, that's a tough one. Any reactions, panelists? That would be quite an earthquake, I'm sure. We are so interdependent, of course, but at the same time, yeah, California, you hear some Texas wanting to entertain that idea. Texans?
Yeah, the Texas or Cali exit, that has been mentioned a lot over the course of the past 24 months or so. I can't wrap my head around it. I sort of think back to Lincoln wanting to keep the Union together during the Civil War. I relate to that in this moment because my instinct is to say no. But maybe that's because it's very novel. I think this is such a beautiful place in large part because of our differences. I look at Kent County, for example, and it's an incredibly varied terrain. And I think the United States is a macro varied terrain. I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know that I think it's a great idea, but I know it's something that is raised a lot more often now.
Yeah.
And so I'm stymied by that idea.
Bad idea. I don't, and I'm a pragmatist, I don't think it solves anything. I mean, the fundamental problem, to me, the discussion of that is that states don't feel that they have the liberty to do what they want to do. So there is a little need for more federalism and localism, which is a solvable problem. It really is a solvable problem. And then there is the notion that everybody needs to be like me. That is going out to the states, right? And David French again talked about that. No, everybody doesn't need to be like you. You're terrific as you are. And then it's hard to think where that ends. Does Northern California separate from Southern California? Does the Valley, where it's pretty conservative, separate from the progressive coast? And then does Michigan separate, Detroit and the rest of the state, or the UP from us? I don't know. I don't know how it ends, and I don't think it solves anything. The solution is just, and some people talk about a marriage. It's a group house. We're a group house with 50 members of the living in the house, and I don't think anything gets solved by kicking one out or adding one in. The fundamental issue is that being able to tolerate difference, real difference, real tolerance, like putting up with someone you disagree is tolerance. And we just have to let that happen at the state level in a better way. We did let that happen when we had a smaller centralized government and states had more authority and power, and then they also devolved to localities. I don't see Cal exit or California and Texas exit solving that fundamental issue,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a relevant question. You think about Brexit and that exit, and that conversation is still going on, and they're finding out that in some ways it's been a problem now, and they're trying to solve it and go with some end arounds. But it's an interesting question, especially when this topic is really about common ground. And what comes to mind to me immediately is situations of war, what happened in Northern Ireland and went on for years and years. And so the damage would be tremendous. So I do have that sense that you mentioned, Doug, that we really need to resolve our differences, and that this is an exciting opportunity as well to have that constant debate, that in a way that this whole discussion is all really around, is what democracy is.
Right.
It's working these things out over, unfortunately, sometimes a lot of time with some collateral damage, but it's the ideal that I would embrace. Anybody else?
I just want to add one more point on the group house. I think that's a great analogy for the United States. And the lawyer in me is kicking in now too. And I wonder logistically how that would look. We have Sunbelt states that actually use a lot of the money that Californians pay in federal taxes. What would they do without that income? Do we have tariffs on almonds that are coming out of California? And so the logistics and the devil, again, being in the details. And so there are practical reasons why that's not a great idea, but then there's the e pluribus unum philosophical reason why that's not a great idea too.
Yeah, excellent, yeah.
Hi, this is a great discussion. And kind of building on the previous question, some states have gotten so much more populous than others since our founding, like California and Texas, but we still have 2 senators per state. So I think I read the other day that the 50 Democrats in the Senate represent 40 million more people than the 50 Republicans, or something on that scale. What are some ways, are there talks on how to reconcile that so the Senate is more reflective of the population, other than with seceding?
Wow.
I don't want it to be, and I don't think it should. I'll just stop there, just to kind of raise somebody's response.
reforming the Senate is something I think that we hear, it's a phrase we hear more and more. Abolish the Senate is something you also hear. I'm not sure I'm there, I'm sort of an institutionalist, but it is one of those structural advantages that the minority does have in this country. And I think it's worth examining reform, not abolishment, but we're seeing that right now in real time, where the state of Arizona that represents a certain number of voters is literally holding up a package that is largely bipartisan, not completely. And so this state with this population is holding up things that, investments in people throughout the country, and that doesn't seem quite right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. We're going to argue. This is good. I like this, Kathleen. You know, the notion of minority rights has, look at the list of things that has protected over the last 100 and 150 years. Minority religions, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Amish, folks who don't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance in school, LGBT community in many ways, racial and ethnic minorities in many ways. So minority rights over time often protects progressive entities from a democracy which is pretty conservative, I would have to say. The statistics are correct, yes. The most conservative 50 senators, there's a lot of fewer constituents than the most liberal 50 senators. But hey, get your stuff in gear on those smaller states and elect some Democrats. Don't amend the Constitution for electoral ineffectiveness. Now that's got to, come on, that has to
be a
response.
My response is just that I don't know that we're talking about individual rights.
Yeah.
You know, and now we're just going back to the basics of the Constitution. The things that you mentioned are indeed individual rights, and individual rights need to be protected from majority oppression. But I don't know that, your point is well taken on get your act together, but having one state with a population of X holding up things, something that the rest of the country agrees on, I'm not sure that's the kind of oppression that individual rights were designed to.
Yeah, sure. I think in 2 months it'll be fixed, right? You know, we'll have to see. And you know, people run for public office to have power and influence. And I do think the folks that are holding it up now at the moment are deal makers. They want to get to yes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very legitimate exercise of a political leader is, I'm going to hold this stuff up. I want to get to yes, but you're going to have to meet these conditions. And so it's irritating when you have a different position in what things done.
Well,
but I'm not sure the solution is better than the problem.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, West Virginia told us what they wanted.
Yeah.
Arizona, we're still waiting.
Yeah, we're still waiting.
So
Yeah.
hopefully we'll hear that today.
Well,
Yeah.
we hope so. So I think there was another question in the back.
If you were all-knowing and omnipotent and could create two functional parties where compromise is not a dirty four-letter word, how would you do that via coalitions, either new or imagined? Or excuse me, current or new?
Is that clear, that question?
What would they look like, or how would we put them together, or?
Correct. So like if you had a Dem and a Republican and you were putting it together via coalitions, how would you do that? What coalitions would go where? Because clearly our two parties are not functional right now. So how would you create newly imagined parties via coalitions?
I think going back and looking at some of the things that fell apart, and as I recall, there were opportunities. I remember hearing Debbie Stabenow on this stage talking about how the women in Congress would get together, both sides of the party, for dinner once a month, and how useful that was in creating relationships and respect. And that some of those sort of institutional habits and norms have disappeared. And even when the newly electeds came together and were trained in the same space, I think that's some foundational work that needs to happen in order to create those relationships in the first place. But you know, structurally, and I mean, those are structures to some degree in terms of training and so on, but I don't know how to build these coalitions in a time of such division. That's a huge question. Good question.
Yeah, I think I don't know that I would put together two parties as much as I would look back at what used to work. And I have this vision of Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy working together on pieces of legislation, and the socializing piece and the talking piece, like what we're doing right now. I don't know that I'd redesign parties to be more functional as much as I'd suggest that we engage in things like this more often, and talking to each other and interacting as human beings more often.
Yeah, so in 1950, the American Political Science Association wrote this thing in the 50s, in need of more responsible parties, because they thought there wasn't a dime's bit of difference between Republicans and Democrats at the time. And one of the things they pointed out is that people at the margins of society don't feel they have, because both parties moved to the middle, and the middle class, upper middle class, gets all their needs met, but folks at the margins, whatever you define as the margin, don't feel heard by the system. So they urged for more differentiation between the two parties. And I think we have to appreciate what hyperpartisanship does bring. You actually are paying attention to Black Lives Matter, and you're paying attention to the alienated white working class male. So I'm not sure it's the parties. I do think it's leaders, it's people who select, usually self-select, to run for public office, who after they can hold to their position, but they want to reach an agreement, like Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy. You know, Orrin Hatch was very conservative, and Ted Kennedy very progressive, but they appreciated practically, and I think personally, the contribution the other made. And it is these personal connections that actually do matter. Individual human leadership matters in legislatures. And how do you get the caucuses to select leaders who are deal makers rather than ideologues? I don't know, but I don't think the problem is the party and the electorate. I think it's partly the party organization, and I think it's partly the party in government, but I don't think fundamentally the problem is the extreme partisanship of people. It's legislators and executives who don't believe they're able to hold their convictions and also try to get a deal done to meet an emerging, a presenting need, right? So it's socialization, I think, of leadership more than grassroots, distribution of interest groups.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Well, I think with that, I will be wrapping this up in a minute, but the whole purpose of this is to look at ways we can find common ground. And your point is well taken. We have a two-party system, and we often look at issues in a binary fashion. It's yes or no, win or lose. And life itself is so much more complicated and murky than that. So I think that as a society, we have to work in all of our institutions to get away from that binary thinking, that zero-sum thinking, we either trust you or we don't. I know locally, it was always difficult with issues like, for example, police reform. The union might say, you're for us or you're against us. It's not for and against. It's much more complicated to get that policy work done. And hopefully people will not be looking at just winning elections, but implementing good policy, which takes time. So I'd like to ask Jacob to come up. I know he's gonna wrap things up for us. And thank you again for coming today, for taking the time on a beautiful Saturday when there's art prize out there, for listening to this important discussion about coming together.
Absolutely. Let's have a round of applause for Ruth.